this has been planned for almost a year to have Bob Turner come and speak with us. So this weekend he's been speaking to our leaders Friday night and Saturday morning, and then last evening a lot of us, not everybody, went out to the camp for the steak dinner, so that was very enjoyable. But Bob is from Virginia Beach, and he's got a kind of a long history in churches of being a preacher and teachers in some of the schools, and now he works in leadership, helping churches and sometimes in business as well understand leadership and potential and working with people and motivation and trying to figure out how we can all come together. And sometimes that's a challenge as a church. So this is kind of what he's going to be talking about today in the Bible class, and then he's also going to be doing the sermon. So he's going to explain it all, and then it'll be as clear as crystal. So I'll let Bob come up, and he can share the rest of that he needs to share. And I think he's going to start with a little bit of what he does at Sunset International Bible Institute with this SALT program. What is SALT anyway, Bob? Tell us. We need to know the saltiness.
Okay. Thank you. I do thank you. I am so thankful for the opportunity to get to be here. It's a blessing to me. I have enjoyed so much this weekend getting to meet some of the different men in the congregation, both elders, deacons, and of course getting to spend time with Peter. And it was just such a blessing. And Peter sent me an email earlier in the week, and he asked me if I wanted to go to the camp. And he said, steak dinner. And I said, you had me that. Steak dinner, I was all in. So I really enjoyed being there last night and getting to meet different folks and to have the opportunity to visit. It was just such a wonderful time to be a part of that. Come on in. To tell you a little bit about what I do, I travel across the country and I work with a number of different congregations. I travel 2, sometimes 3 weekends a month, depending on the situation. And what I do is I help congregations in leadership development or whatever their area may be. We try to tailor the material and the workshop specifically around what is needed. I do want to point out, you can see in the very left-hand bottom corner of the PowerPoint slide an email address. I know it's kind of faint, but the website address, is salt.sunset.bible. And I encourage you to go there. There are a lot of resources on that. I put out a blog Monday through Friday. It's about 100 words. Doesn't take but about a minute to read it. But it has a little tidbit about leadership. You can subscribe to that and get that every day. There are also some podcasts on there where I've interviewed leaders, elders, other leaders in the church over the last several years. You can also listen to those podcasts. I've also done some video clips, little 7 to 10 minute little video clips that talk about various things in regards to leadership. You can watch those. And there are 106 Bible class lessons about leadership, various aspects of leadership. And so you can go to that website. All that material is there, and I encourage you to go there, download that, use it however you want to. I just want it to be a blessing to you, and we really want to be a resource to help congregations in whatever way we can. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be here this weekend, and certainly the privilege of being able to teach class and to bring the lesson to you this morning. During the Bible class, I want to share some things with you in regards to what I have called the spirituality spectrum. The information I'm going to share with you comes from obviously the main source that we use of the Bible, but I was introduced to a guy by the name of Bert Paddock several years ago, and Bert had developed some material that he was telling me about, and he encouraged me to read 3 different books, and all of those books are listed at the bottom because they all factored into the material that I'm going to share with you. One of the books by Corrine Ware, Your Spirituality Type. Another book by Mark Allen Poe is one that talks about what they hear. It's the idea of the distance between the pulpit and the pew. It's one thing to know what we're saying, even though it's in the same language, but what I say may not be what you hear or what you think you hear. And so how do we bridge that gap so that we have understanding? And then the last book by Urban Holmes III is a book called The History of Christian Spirituality. And he's kind of the base for which the other books were written and a lot of what you're going to hear today. But primarily what we're going to be focused on is this idea of how do we work together as the church. You know, when you think about the church and what you find in the Bible is the church is described in a lot of different ways. One of my favorites is that it's described as the bride of Christ. I love that idea. I love the beauty and the imagery that goes along with the concept of the church being the bride of Christ. I like the fact that the Bible refers to us as saints. But I also love the fact that Paul, who used this terminology more than anyone else, referred to the church as a body. Now, when you think about our bodies, I mean, we have various parts of the body. We got hands, we got feet, we got eyes, we got ears, we got nose. I mean, we got all these various parts. Internally, we got lungs, we got heart, we got stomach. I mean, we got all these things happening. They all come together and they work together in order for the body to function the way it was designed to. Well, the church is described as a body for that very same reason. It was designed by God to function in a specific way. And there are a number of passages that really point us to this. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 4 through 11, you're going to read about the church being given a number of different gifts. Some of those gifts are obviously of a miraculous nature, and we don't have some of those gifts today. But in Romans chapter 12, we also find in verses 4 through 8 that Paul also gives a list of gifts, if you will, talents or abilities that are ascribed to the church that really help us understand the importance of everyone working together. Now, it's in the latter part of 1 Corinthians chapter 12 that I try to hone in on. And the reason I do is because regardless of the gifts that we would find on the left-hand side of these quadrants up here, it's this text here specifically in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and again in Ephesians chapter 4 that we're going to find Paul talk about the body and the importance of the various parts of the body working together. And this is what I love about 1 Corinthians 12 and again in Ephesians chapter 4. Because there's not any one part of the body that is more important than the other. Now, we tend to think that sometimes. We tend to think, well, we've got elders up here, we've got the preacher up here, we've got deacons, we've got Bible class teachers. Let me tell you, there is no one person in the church that is more important than anyone else. No one. And so Paul describes for us that every part is needed. I mean, the eyes don't say to the ears, we have no need of you. The hands don't say to the feet, we have no need of you. Each part of the body is important. And what I love about what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4 is that it takes every ligament, every joint, every part of the body working together as it was designed to the building up of itself in love so that it functions the way that God intended it to. Now, we all know that when there's a part of our body that's not working, maybe we've broken an arm, or maybe we've stubbed a toe, or maybe we've done something else, and the body is not working well. It's hurting. Something's wrong. And we know that we try to do whatever it takes to try to fix it so that it begins to work the way that God intended it to. Same thing is true in the church. God intended every single individual in the body to do their part so that the church would function the way that God intended it to. And when people don't do that, when they're not carrying out their role and using their ability in the way that God designed them to, the church doesn't function the way God wants it to. And it takes all of us working together in order for that to happen. Now, here's the thing. As you're going to see from these quadrants up here in the material that I'm about to share with you, it's very fascinating to me to see how that people are different. You know, I look around this room and I don't see anybody that looks like me. Now, there are a few heads that are close. You know, one of my favorite things that happened to me, I was visiting in Idaho one time, and there's a place there called Blaze Pizza. Y'all know Blaze? Y'all have Blaze Pizza here? Okay. So we were there at Blaze Pizza, and the way it works is you kind of order what you want on your pizzas, you go through the line, and then you wait, and then they call your name when it's ready. Well, I was standing down there at the end, and there was a group of teenage boys, And so I'm standing there visiting with them. I had no idea who they were. I was just kind of engaging them in conversation because I was there preaching. And I thought maybe I'd invite them to the worship assembly. And so we're talking, and they called my name, so I got my pizza. And as I'm walking to the table, one of those boys said, "Man, your head is shiny." And I thought, "Thanks, Idaho." It is, it's shiny. My grandson thinks I'm Mr. Clean. Every time he goes in the grocery store, he sees the bottle, he goes, "Papa." And I'm like, no. But you know, I look around the room and none of us look alike. We're all different. And the interesting thing about the fact that we're all different is we're not just different in the way that we look. We're different in the way that we think because we were all raised differently. We all have different educational backgrounds. We all were raised in different cultures, maybe different parts of the country, but we all have differences. And sometimes we need to learn how to embrace those differences. And even though we may be different, we can still show respect. You know, it took me 50 years of life to realize you don't have to agree with people to show respect. We don't have to agree with people to be respectful and show kindness and love. And so what I'm going to show you is basically 4 types of spirituality that exists in the church, if you will. And maybe some of these will resonate with you and maybe not. Don't make a decision and say, "Oh, that's me," before you've listened to all 4 of them. Now, here's the way this works. When you think about this spectrum, at the top, you have this idea of the mind. This is kind of the head. It's the knowledge part of our being. It's where all of those things like facts and figures and analytical information, it's where we store all the stuff that has happened in our entire life and all of our education. At the bottom half of this spectrum, we have the heart. Now, the heart is known as the seat of our emotions. And all of us have both. And the interesting thing about your brain is that you have 2 parts to your brain. The outer part, the neocortex, is where the mind is, where you get all of those facts and figures and analytical stuff. The inner part of your brain is the limbic part of your brain, and that is your heart. That's the seat of your emotions. All of your emotions and the functions of those emotions flow out of the limbic part of your brain, head and heart. On the right-hand side of this quadrant, you have what is known. Specifically, what is known about God. And of course, we know what is known about God because of what He has revealed to us in Scripture, and that's what we know. Now, on the left-hand side of this quadrant, you have what is mysterious. There are a lot of things we don't know about God. I mean, how does the Holy Spirit really work today? I get that question a lot. That's a challenging question, isn't it? I mean, how does the Holy Spirit really work in our lives today? How does God providentially guide our paths? I mean, how is it that I happen to be in Royal Oak, Michigan this weekend, if not providentially through God's working to make that happen? There are a lot of things I don't know. They're very mysterious. Now, because there are these 4 points, as you can see on this cross axes, if you will, you're going to notice that the quadrants kind of reflect those components. Notice, for example, on the right-hand side in the upper quadrant, you have the idea of what we refer to as educational quadrant. You got the mind, and you've got what's known about God. And so this becomes a very educational piece. Now, this is what we call head spirituality, and to give you an idea of some of the types of activities that those who would cling to this type of spirituality and that would enhance that type of spirituality, now, as you can see, there's corporate gathering. People who fall in the educational quadrant enjoy and appreciate and value gathering together as God's people. These are also the folks who want more study groups. They would rather be in Bible study every day during the week than anything else. They love that. The idea is they want better sermons. And I think we all do. I mean, I do. I want better sermons. We're centered on the spoken word. Content is primary. Used to have a friend that said, if you can't read it, you don't need it. And I thought, well, that's an interesting approach. If you can't read it, you don't need it. Content's primary. They're opposed to experience and they're opposed to feeling. I want that to resonate for just a moment because it's going to make a big characteristic difference between what we're going to see with the other quadrants. They want things done decently and in order. And so this is the educational quadrant. Now, before you begin thinking, well, that's us. That may be us, but listen to the next quadrant. This next quadrant is known as the relational quadrant, and as you can see, we've moved down, still talking about what's known about God, but now we're moving into that emotional part, the heart of the individual. And notice what enhances in this heart spirituality, notice what enhances them in this quadrant. They're looking for an emotional or moving experience. Now, don't get me wrong, I think we can take emotion to extreme. But I have lived 62 years of my life in the Lord's church. And what I have seen over and over is almost the suppression of emotion rather than the encouragement of emotion. God made us emotional beings. It's okay if we say amen once in a while. It's okay to say praise God once in a while. It's okay for us to be excited about what God has done for us. Because if we can't be joyous and excited about the fact that God came in the flesh, died on the cross, and was raised the third day so that we could be forgiven, then maybe there's something wrong with us. There's nothing wrong with being emotional, passionate, excited. And it seems like the only emotion that we tend to experience is sadness and sorrow. And I tell you, most congregations that I've attended, it's more like attending a funeral than it is a celebration. Maybe we need to rethink which quadrant we should be in. These are people who want a closer walk with God. Evangelism is based on experience. They like telling how they became a Christian. Now, before you begin thinking, no, that's not what we do, let me remind you, in the book of Acts, that's all the Apostle Paul did. Was he went around telling how he became a Christian, how he came to the Lord in the experience that he had. There's nothing wrong with us talking about such. Prayer is less formal, and when I say that, there are some folks, nothing wrong with this, please don't misunderstand what I'm about to say, but some folks tend to approach prayer as though they're reading from the King James Version of the Bible. And there are some folks who don't prefer to pray that way. They want it to be less formal in nature. And sometimes we think that the only way to pray is if you start a certain way and if you end a certain way. But again, think about prayer that we read about in the Bible. Can we not pray like Elisha did? Lord, open his eyes that he may see. That's all he said. I'll tell you, a lot of times I'm driving down the road. I'm not going to bow my head when I'm driving down the road praying. Aren't you thankful? I mean, I'm not going to do that. And so it's okay for me to be praying while I'm driving. In fact, I do a lot of praying when I'm driving in Virginia Beach. But the thing is, I'm not going to start by saying, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. That's not the way I do that. I just start talking to God. I just started talking to him and telling him what's on my mind and on my heart. Don't we all do that at some point? And so prayer becomes a little less formal. Personal service to others is important. To those in the relational quadrant, they're more spontaneous in nature. I love this part. They're very family oriented. They want to know that the people they're sitting next to on the pew, that has a brother and sister. And then, of course, they like to see expressions of faith. Now, what's interesting to me about the relational quadrant is the fact that when I really begin to think about it, sometimes I think I'm kind of more that than I am educational. Although I know that educational is important, and there have been times in my life where I was very educational, and I tend to think I'm kind of on this swing, maybe, and have kind of become more relational in nature. On the other side of these four quadrants, we have what's known as the formational quadrant. In this lower left-hand section, you have the idea of the heart, but now we're kind of entering into that section where it's maybe a bit more mysterious in nature. And this particular side of the quadrant is very fascinating to me because this is kind of a mystic spirituality, if you will. And notice some of the activities that enhance this. These are people that they like to hear from God more than speaking to God. Now, please don't misunderstand. The idea of hearing from God isn't necessarily that they're expecting God to audibly speak to them in a dream. They may think that, but that's generally not the idea. But they're listening to see how God is communicating to them. Have you ever had somebody come to you and give you wise counsel? Is it possible that God was using them to help you understand something that you needed to know in your life? Do you find it interesting that that one of the things that the Bible never addresses is dating? It talks a lot about marriage, but it doesn't say anything about dating. So how do we deal with that? Well, I'm appreciative of the fact that I've had wise counselors in my life that gave me information to help me with that. Now, was that God communicating to me in some way through them to help me understand how I needed to handle my children when it came to that? I don't know. Some people would say yes, some people would say no, but the idea here is people like to hear from God. They also like to hear from what God has to say in His Word. So don't think they're discounting the importance of listening to what God says in His Word. And then these are individuals who believe that they're on a journey to a union with God. They're very contemplative and very introspective. You know, the thing I like about this particular quadrant is the fact that a lot of times we're not good at self-reflection. We don't really like to look at ourselves and examine those things in our life that might not be good, that maybe we need to work on, that we need to fix. But people in the formational quadrant, they really appreciate and value the time of introspection. They really like to reflect and say, you know, where am I? How am I doing this? How do I need to improve or make changes in my life? They're focused on the inner world. Austerity and asceticism are appealing to them. It's something that is very interesting to me, especially when you're thinking about simplicity. I have a son and a daughter-in-law that they like to use the term they're minimalists. And I'm thinking, okay, so tell me what that means for you. They're minimalists. And I'm okay with the fact that somebody wants to live on less. I think that's a good thing. But they're very simplistic in the way they approach life. I don't know that my son has more than about 2 pairs of shorts and 1 pair of pants. And he just kind of wears those all the time. And I'm thinking, when those wear out, he says, I get another pair. And I'm like, you know, that's a pretty good idea. As long as you wash them, I think that's a good idea. And so, you know, people are just approaching life differently. Some folks like to live very minimally, and I think that's good. I'm not one of them. I've got about 18 pair of shoes in my closet. I mean, everybody's different. But folks in this quadrant, they're very simplistic in the way they approach life. But here's the question they ask that I wished all of us would get. What could we do if we were open to it? Isn't that a powerful question? Why don't we ask that question more? What could we do? The way I like to ask it is this. My daughter gave me a little paperweight that I have on my desk. And I love that paperweight because it asks this question. What would you attempt to do if you knew you couldn't fail? You ever asked yourself that? What could the Royal Oak congregation do if you knew you could not fail? I want that to sit for just a second because I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say. You can't fail. The only way you fail is if you give up. And when you think about it, I want you to realize the 2 things from the Bible. God is with you and God is for you. And if God is for us, who can be against us? Seeing that He did not spare His only Son, but delivered Him up for us all, how will He not also in Him freely give us all things? Who will bring a charge against God's elect? God is the one who justifies. Christ Jesus is He who died, yes, who was raised, who is seated at the right hand of God, who also intercedes for us. Who will separate us from the love of God? Tribulation, distress, persecution, nakedness, famine, peril, sword. In all of these things, we overwhelmingly conquer through Him who loves us. You think God's going to let us fail when we're doing His work? Greater is He that is in me than he that is in the world. So what could we do if we were open to it? The people in this quadrant also seek solitude and silence. Sometimes, they like to say, I just want to be alone. Sometimes they like to go out and experience God in creation. And what a beautiful thing. I had the opportunity this morning of being able to go for a run over there where Don and Tracy live. And literally on my way back, I'm running past deer. I thought I could reach out and touch them. Could have pet one of those this morning. They were probably looking at me thinking, is that all you got? I mean, they're thinking, can you not run any faster than that? I'm thinking, I'm not in this for speed. But the whole thing is I'm just observing God's creation, how beautiful it is to see the sun rise. Isn't that awesome? I mean, there are times in my life I think I really like this quadrant. And then the fourth quadrant is known as the applicational quadrant. Now, the applicational quadrant is going to tie in not just the mysterious thing, but it's really about the mind and how we're taking those things and applying things in our life. Now, this is what is referred to as a kingdom spirituality. And notice the characteristics that enhance, or the activities that enhance this spirituality. They're active visionary. They're very single-minded. People who are in this quadrant are very single-minded in the way they approach things. They're very deeply focused. They're crusaders. They're courageous. They're sturdy idealists. They feel like they're responsible for change. I kind of like this. They're passionate to transform society. They feel like it's their responsibility to rectify the wrongs of the world. And they're very aggressive and assertive. And they're the people you're going to see at freedom marches, standing outside abortion clinics, and the list goes on and on. These are the people that are in this quadrant. These are the people that they're the ones who are saying, don't tell me about your Christianity, show me your Christianity. So as you think about these four quadrants, I want you to think about something for just a moment. We live in a very interesting world, and over the last several years, I've actually done some testing with congregations on an individual and congregational level about where they saw themselves in these four quadrants. As a result of that research, what's been interesting to me is that for the most part, on an individual basis, people saw themselves individually in the relational quadrant, the lower right-hand side. They saw the congregation that they attended as being in the upper right-hand side of the educational quadrant. Very few, if any, ever saw themselves as being formational or applicational. Here's the challenge. When we look at the life of Jesus, what we find is that Jesus was in all four quadrants at various times in his life. There's no doubt that he was educational. I mean, you can't read Luke chapter 2 and Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7 without realizing he was a man of God's word, and he spoke the word, and he taught what God wanted to be taught. He was educational. But we also find he was very relational in nature, if you will. I mean, it doesn't take long reading through the Gospels to find out that Jesus was emotional in nature. But the fact that he established the church to be the family of God, to be the body of Christ, tells us a lot about the fact he was relational in nature. But he also was very formational. There were times when Jesus needed to be alone, and he would go off into the wilderness. 40 days and 40 nights, we read, he went off into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. There were times where he would go up to the mountain alone to pray. Times he would spend the entire night in prayer. You ever done that? I tell you, if you are not participating in the prayer before services that takes place at 9:15 down here in the down in the hallway, I don't know what room it's in, that was probably one of the greatest blessings of my trip. To sit in that room and hear men pray for you. To pray for you. To pray about this church. To pray about the families of this church. And to pray about the people in this community and reaching people in this community. I was so thankful to get to be a part of that this morning. I'm trying to figure out, how do I get that started back in Virginia Beach? We need to do that. What a blessing. And if you have more people in there, you might be surprised how much more time you're spending in prayer and not realize it. What a beautiful thing. Jesus was formational, and I don't know anybody that was more applicational than Jesus. I mean, He healed the sick. He gave sight to the blind. He gave hearing to the deaf and tongue to those who were mute. I mean, strength to the legs of the lame. And He raised the dead. He fed the hungry. I mean, Jesus was applicational in nature. He was all for these things. Now, Urban Holmes, as he talked about, well, let me say this first. At the heart of this, as you can see, is the idea of making disciples. Now, here's kind of my point. Because the church, individually and collectively, sees themselves on the right-hand side of this quadrant, or these quadrants, what happens is we don't realize that the world sees themselves on the left-hand side. People who would refer to themselves as being spiritual in nature tend to see themselves as either being formational or applicational. And we're living during a time where people really see, especially a younger generation, are challenging us on the application of our faith. And they're very much, I have a daughter and son-in-law that are very much in this quadrant. I mean, they are actively involved in helping those who are suffering deal with addictions, people who are homeless. I mean, the social injustices that are taking place in our world, they are actively involved in trying to deal with those things. And the question they keep asking is, where is the church? Where is the church when it comes to our activity in the world? They've actually been involved in pushing my wife and myself to get involved in what's known as the Crisis Pregnancy Center. I never knew how powerful that would be. To be involved in helping sometimes a lot of younger ladies that are single mothers, expecting mothers, who just need help. Somebody to give them hope. They've opted out of abortion to keep the child, and now they need help. And a Crisis Pregnancy Center provides it. And so we are there to be able to provide education for them and some spiritual guidance. What an opportunity. Now, don't get me wrong. I think we need to be educational in nature and we need to be relational in nature. But there are times we may need to think about being formational in nature, and we certainly need to be giving thought to the applicational side of this. Because here's the thing, it takes all four of these kinds of people working together to make disciples. Now, as I mentioned, sometimes when we look at ourselves individually and collectively as a church, we see ourselves on the right-hand side. The world sees themselves on the left-hand side, and the chasm that has developed between these two sides is so great that we don't know how to reach people on the other side. And the way this has happened, at least my experience, is that people who are in the educational quadrant or the relational quadrant, they don't understand people who are formational or applicational. I mean, I haven't met anybody yet that sees themselves in the educational quadrant that has any idea how to reach someone in the formational quadrant. What do you mean you want to experience God in creation? Get your head in the Bible. I mean, that's the way we approach it. But the funny thing is, people in the formational quadrant don't understand people in the educational quadrant. Is there not a way that we can find out that it's important that both are needed in the church and that somehow we can work together to accomplish what God wants us to do? What about the relational and the applicational side? I mean, I'm a hugger, and so I'm going to hug you, so I like to hug you. Well, people in the application quadrant are like, what are you doing? Why aren't you out here helping people on the street? And it works both ways. Isn't it interesting to think that we're all different? We're all made up differently. Now, Urban Holmes, in his book, developed what he called the circle of sensibility. And I like that terminology, the circle of sensibility. You see, inside the circle of sensibility, we recognize that we need each other. We can't do this alone. We can't make everybody educational, because if we do, we'll never reach anybody in the world. We can't make everybody relational, because if we do, we can't reach anybody in the world. And if we can't make everybody formational, because then we're never going to be able to encourage people who are educational. And we can't make everybody applicational. It takes everybody working together, doing their part to strengthen the body so it functions the way God designed it. Now, Urban Holmes talked about people outside the circle of sensibility go to extremes. For example, people who are extreme in the educational side are very legalistic and very dogmatic. We would describe them as on the far right of the spectrum. I mean, these are the people that are going to be so dogmatic about the way things are done, even when it comes down to opinions, that they're going to believe that you are in sin if you are not doing things exactly the way they do them. Very Pharisaical in nature. You go to the Bible, read about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These are the extremists of the educational quadrant. Now, those who are extreme in the relational side of things become very pietous, and they're driven extremely emotionally. I mean, to the extreme that if they are not getting something out of it, then they think that it's wrong and they're going to go somewhere else. They want to be moved emotionally. They want to experience it emotionally to extreme levels. And then those extreme in the formational quadrant are very reclusive. Reclusivism. They are exaggerated retreats. These would be people that we would consider to be like monks in a monastery. They separate themselves from the world and have no influence in the world as a result. And they just want to be away from everyone and everything. Now, I can tell you, I am very introverted, and there are times in my life I can appreciate that. There are times I want to be away from people, but not to an exaggerated extent. And then those who are extreme in the applicational side just have this moralism, this unrelenting tunnel vision, that they can't see anything outside of doing just this. And so when we think about these various quadrants and the ideas behind them, again, don't pigeonhole yourself and say, oh, this is just me. I'm right here. Or I'm over here. What we really need is balance. We need balance in all four of those quadrants if we're going to function the way God intends us to as the church. And the only way that we're going to be able to reach people in the world is if we develop some way of understanding folks who are in that formational and applicational side of the quadrants. Because if all we're doing is looking for people who are like us, who think like us, who live like us, the church won't grow. Because those people in the world don't think they need us. So we've got to think, how are we going to work together to achieve what God intended? I want to take us back as we come down to the last few minutes of class to a passage in the Old Testament. It's probably one of the most overlooked chapters in all of the Bible. And the chapter that I'm talking about is in the book of Nehemiah. Now, the book of Nehemiah is an incredible book to me. I really like the book of Nehemiah because it's a book that deals a lot with leadership. In fact, there are a lot of leadership principles that are found there, and we use the book of Nehemiah a lot for leadership. And I love how the fact that here you have an individual that it was so God-centered. I mean, Nehemiah was so God-centered. Nothing took place without him praying to the God of heaven. And we see that in chapter 1 as it develops. Then we get into chapter 2, and people really love the narrative of how he goes back to Jerusalem with permission from the king, and he calls all the leaders together, and he tells them that you see the situation that exists. The walls have been torn down, the gates have been burned, and he said, let us arise and build so that we'll no longer be a reproach among the nations. And I told him how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and I told him the words of the king. And the people said, let us arise and build. And they put their hand to the good work. I love those in chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. I love those two verses because in those two verses we see how that Nehemiah explained the problem, the need that existed. He also gave them a solution and he told them why. But it wasn't until he gave them hope when he gave them hope and told them how the hand of his God had been favorable to him, and told them the words of the king, that only then did the people say, "Let us arise and build." And then what generally happens as we're reading through Nehemiah, we get to chapter 3 and we start reading about the high priest, and they did this and they did that, and we kind of skip over that and we go to chapter 4, because chapter 4 takes us back to the narrative. And so we tend to overlook chapter 3, and yet chapter 3 is probably the most significant and the most powerful chapter in all of the book of Nehemiah for the church today. And here's why. As I read through Nehemiah chapter 3 many times, I started noticing that there is not one time in that entire chapter where anyone who had a skill as a brick or a stone mason is mentioned. You ever think about that? Here they are, they're rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem, and there is not one of them that is identified as a stone or a brick mason. In fact, what you find in chapter 3 is that it started with the leadership, the high priest and his family. It started with them. And I'm convinced that until leaders lead the way, then people will not follow. You got to have leadership that's doing their part in order for others to understand the direction. So it starts with leadership, and from there, you're going to read about families, fathers and daughters who are working together. You're going to read about people who were jewelers and merchants and goldsmiths. You're going to have all these different people with not a stonemason skill set, and they're out here rebuilding the wall. That fascinated me, because I'm thinking, you mean you don't have to have a preacher to do the work? You don't have to have an elder to do the work? No, look around the room. You and I, we're the ones that we're supposed to do the work. And I love how that text points out that some worked with zeal. I mean, some people are just passionate, and I love those people. I love to be around those people. They're infectious. To be around people who are passionate, it's so exciting and invigorating to see those people. I'm like, I want to be like that. And as I read through that chapter, there were two things that stood out to me that I had never noticed before. And it's the most important part of the chapter. There are two phrases. The first phrase is used in the first half of the chapter, and the second phrase is used in the second half of the chapter. And I couldn't figure out for the longest time why that Nehemiah switched midway through that chapter. In the first half of the chapter, you have this phrase that is next to. And next to him, this person was working. And next to them, this group was working. And next to them, this team was working. And next to them, this guy was working. And next to him, this guy was. It's just next to and next to and next to. And I thought, that is so cool, because what that meant is from the leadership all the way down, everyone was in the trenches working side by side doing the work. And that's what it takes. That's what it takes in the church. It takes everybody in the trenches working side by side to do the work. And then the phrase changes. Halfway through the chapter, it changes to this. And after him, this guy worked. And after them, this guy worked. And after him, this group worked. And after them. And I thought, why? What is the shift here? What's taking place? And then I realized I couldn't figure out how I missed it for so long. People are only able to build so high. And they have to have someone who's willing to come along after them to build on the work that they started. You talk about fascinating, because that's exactly what the church is. However many decades ago it was. We were discussing over the weekend whether it was 80 or 90 years ago when this church was first implemented here or established here. But the people who were a part of that generation that planted a church here in Royal Oak, Michigan, they did the work side by side in the trenches. And everyone in this room, you're standing on the shoulders of some great men and women of the faith who had the vision to do what they did at that time. The challenge for you is, are you going to come along after them and build on the wall that they started in this community to accomplish what God wants for His people? Ask yourselves, what kind of church do you want to leave for your children and your grandchildren? When they come along after you, what kind of foundation will you have laid for them? The only way that God's church moves forward and grows is when we work together. No matter whether we're educational, relational, formational, or applicational. No matter where we are at on this spirituality spectrum, when we realize that we need each other and it takes us working together to accomplish what God wants us to do, will we then provide a foundation for those who come along after us so that the future of the church in Royal Oak, Michigan will be secure. Again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here this weekend. I'm thankful to share some of God's Word with you. I hope it's encouraging. I hope it's challenging to you. I'm really excited about the message during the worship hours. We talk about how we see Jesus changes how we see others. So I look forward to that time. Thank you.